He got married. Turns out it takes just 10 minutes to marry someone. Walking out of the marriage bureau, Richard stared at the little red booklet in his hand, feeling a bit dazed. He was really married, and not to his fiancée, Jenny, but to a stranger he'd known for less than a week. Sorry, Richard, this mission came up suddenly. Can we have our wedding ceremony a month from now? The clear, apologetic voice next to him drew Richard's gaze to her. Under the setting sun, the woman had striking and delicate features. Her fair skin made her seem all the more spirited. Her posture was upright, calm when still, and like an unsheathed sword when in motion, unstoppable, definitely a soldier's stance. This was his new wife, Annie. It's okay. Richard nodded understandingly. Your mission is important. Annie smiled slightly and gave Richard a gentle hug, then said, let's stick to our plan. We'll have the ceremony in City C a month later. I'll come back for you once I finish the mission. In the blink of an eye, she was gone before Richard could react. After taking a minute to accept the fact he was married, Richard put the marriage certificate into his bag and took a cab home. The house was still empty. Ignoring it, Richard went straight to the master bedroom to pack his things. He'd had a marriage arrangement with Jenny since childhood. Living at her place had made sense. But now, married to someone else, he knew he should leave. Just as he found his suitcase, a questioning voice came from the doorway. Where are you going? Richard looked up and saw Jenny standing there, tired lines on her pretty face, rubbing her forehead. Richard, I've been busy. Can't you stop with these leave home and drama stunts? I don't have time for them. Same thing every time. They talked like she was making an effort just to fit him into her schedule. He was really leaving, but she just thought he was acting out. Richard saw no point in explaining, his eyes down as he folded clothes. The hospital's sending me to City B for a bit. Just getting ready. Knowing she misunderstood, Jenny paused, her tone softening slightly. City B is colder, bring warm clothes. Watching Richard sort through his clothes, Jenny hesitated but spoke. Richard, I'm bringing Michael and his son to live here. Tommy needs his residency registered under my name. They're alone in H country and they've done me great favors. Before she could finish, Richard cut in. I don't mind, go ahead. He was about to leave. Whoever else moved into this house didn't concern him anymore. Michael and his son, Tommy, had saved Jenny's life, done big favors for her company too. 6 months ago, Jenny had gone missing due to a terrorist attack on a business trip in Country M. She reappeared at her grandpa's 70th birthday a month ago, bringing Michael and his son along. That day, with all the H-Town elites gathered, she introduced another man as her savior, making Richard look like a joke. Afterward, she said she was merely grateful to Michael for saving her and keeping company secrets safe. But Richard could tell, her looks at Michael weren't innocent, the deep affection evident. Before, he'd act like a lion guarding his territory, blocking Michael. Now he wouldn't. Jenny hadn't expected Richard to agree, seemed a bit surprised. Happy with his compromise, Jenny softened and said, Don't worry, Richard. Once Michael settles here and finds a job, they'll move out. Richard was uninterested in Michael's affairs and changed the subject. About our engagement, Jenny wasn't inclined to listen, cutting him off. The company's too busy now. We'll talk marriage later. Richard tried to explain, I didn't mean, but before he could finish, Jenny's phone rang. Her gaze softened as she answered. Michael, what's up? Tommy misses me? I'll be right there. She left in a hurry, reminding Richard at the door. Richard, have the guest room ready by tomorrow. Michael and Tommy are moving in. A click of the door, and Richard was left alone in the silence. He looked at his hand, still outstretched, smiled wryly, eyes darkened. It wasn't the wedding I wanted to talk about, it was breaking off the engagement. When had Jenny stopped having the patience to listen to him? She looked at him impatiently, like talking to him was a task she disliked. But she hadn't always been like this. The Booths and the Millers families had been friends forever. Richard and Jenny grew up together with an engagement, once the adored golden couple of H-Town. They grew up side by side, never openly expressing love, but she was always there when he turned around. She protected him, supported him like a guardian angel. They'd planned to marry once he came of age. But a car accident at 16 changed everything. His parents gone, the Booths' business taken over by greedy relatives. Richard was treated worse than a servant. In his darkest times, Jenny took him in, helped him finish school and become a doctor. After college, he thought they could fulfill the engagement, start a life together. But she got busier inheriting the family business, always asking him to wait. Wait he did for 6 years. Jenny went from patiently explaining to frowning any time the engagement came up. Richard thought she was just stressed. As long as she loved him, what was waiting a little longer? Then Michael appeared, shattering Richard's illusions. Jenny could meticulously take care of someone, not minding the details. Jenny could ensure someone's well-being every day, worried they'd feel slighted. These things she never did for Richard. The ringing phone broke his thoughts. The pain sharp. Richard looked at the ceiling, holding back tears. Richard, emergency, got a ruptured hepatic hemangioma patient. All experienced surgeons are booked. If you're free, could you take it? Sure. Prep them. I'm on my way. Richard replied to the call from the surgery department. Arriving at 9 p.m., the patient was critical. Richard performed a partial hepatectomy, finishing around 2 a.m. Drained, he returned to his office and slept on the couch. A while later, he awoke when he felt something being draped over him. Opening his eyes, he saw the hospital director, William. Startled, Richard asked, "Did I wake you? I saw you curled up without even a blanket. Thought I'd cover you but ended up waking you." "Oops," William said, slightly regretful. Richard wasn't bothered. "It's fine, I got enough sleep. I'll nap after rounds." William wasn't just his boss. He'd been friends with Richard's dad. He'd seen how hard Richard worked over the years, both proud and sorrowful. "Okay, finish your rounds and then rest," William smiled, heading out. Hesitant, Richard ultimately stopped him. "I need to talk, William. I'm considering resigning." William returned, shocked. "Why so sudden?" "I got married." When William heard that, a look of realization crossed his face with a smile. "Oh, it's Jenny, right? Congrats, Richard. It's great to see your friendship turn into something more after all these years." Richard just gave a little smile and didn't bother to correct William's misunderstanding. William, still excited, didn't notice Richard's hesitation. "Hasn't your grandpa always wanted to see you get married? Now he can finally be at ease." The mention of his grandpa softened Richard's gaze, and this time his smile was genuine. "I hope it makes him happy too. If it weren't for his last wish for me to settle down quickly, I wouldn't have rushed into marrying Annie, who happened to also be pushed by her family to get married." Thinking about taking the marriage certificate to visit his grandpa next time, he hoped it would make him happy. After a little more chatting with William, Richard went to take care of his resignation paperwork and checked the apartment before heading home. He was exhausted from staying up late the night before without enough rest. On the way home in the cab, he felt lightheaded and just wanted to crawl into bed for a good sleep. But the moment he stepped inside his place and saw the scene in the master bedroom, all of his blood rushed to his face, and exhaustion was blasted away by anger. "Tommy, what are you doing?" He snatched the frame from the little boy's hands, and the beautiful painting was ruined by thick black pen marks. Richard felt a dark cloud take over, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. This was the only keepsake of his mother. That painting had been with him for so many years, and now it was destroyed. Fury stirred inside him while he glared at Tommy. Before Richard could say anything, the little boy started wailing. "Uncle Richard, you're so mean. Dad, come quick. Uncle Richard's gonna hit me. I'm scared." The next moment, Michael rushed in, quickly scooping up his son into his arms to comfort him. Hey, what happened here?" A few words of appeasement later, he seemed to notice Richard. With a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he said, "Richard, Tommy's just a kid. Whatever he did wrong or broke, I'll cover it. Come on, don't hold it against a child." Michael had short cropped hair, handsome features, and an air of defiance. He didn't really mean to apologize, looking instead provocatively at Richard. Richard felt a pulse throb at his temples, and he raised the ruined painting, asking sternly, "Who gave you permission to enter my room and break my stuff? You'll pay? How?" Tommy, feeling emboldened, yapped back like a little dog behind its owner. "It's just a dumb painting. I'll ask Aunt Jenny to pay you." Greedy, mean guy. Richard, eyes red with anger, reached out to personally reprimand Tommy. Catching this from the corner of his eye, Michael suddenly gave his son a shove, causing him to hit the corner of the bedside table. "Daddy, it hurts. I'm bleeding." The sharp cry pierced through, and Tommy sat on the floor, crying non-stop, with a serious-looking gash on his forehead, blood running down his face. Michael immediately cradled his son, his voice concerned as he looked at Richard. "Richard, even if Tommy did upset you, did you need to lay a hand on a child? I'm apologizing here, okay?" Richard had seen clearly what Michael did, and now he didn't understand his game. But then he did just a moment later. "Tommy." Jenny rushed in from outside in a hurry. She crouched beside Tommy and then turned an angry glare at Richard, her voice cold. "Richard, Tommy is just a kid. How could you hurt him?" Jenny didn't even ask for an explanation before accusing him. Richard gripped the frame in his hands, feeling his heart freeze over. The strength left his body in an instant. His throat was painfully dry, and the defense he wanted to give was stuck there. Michael, crying, started speaking up. "Jenny, you can't really blame Richard. It's all our fault, mistaking his room for the guest room. We got used to living in basements back in the U. And we didn't resist choosing this room with such good lighting." Tommy messed with Richard's painting, making him mad. Michael's pitiful speech made Jenny's heart ache, and she looked at Richard with even more anger. "It's just a stupid painting. Is there a need for this violence? Richard, you really have quite the temper." Apologized to Michael and Tommy. A stupid painting? That was his mother's only keepsake. Michael might not know, but didn't Jenny? Richard stared at Jenny, his fingers clutching the frame tightly. "I'm not apologizing. Tommy wasn't pushed by me." Jenny got angrier, her pretty face tight. "You still won't admit your fault." Michael tugged at her sleeve, saying considerately, "Let it go, Jenny. Richard doesn't need to apologize. It's our bad for barging into his space. He has every right to be upset." But the more Michael said things like that, the more Jenny felt Richard's expressionless face was too much. With a clenched jaw, she said, "Who says it's right to be angry? This is my house, and I won't have it run by any outsider's whims. Michael, you and Tommy can stay in the master bedroom. Richard can take the guest room." Her words cut into Richard like knives, causing him to falter. An outsider? So all these years, she saw him as just an outsider? It was all so ridiculous. Hearing Jenny say that, Michael felt a thrill inside yet maintained a worried look. The room isn't the issue. It's just Tommy's wound is too serious. "Jenny, can you come with me to take him to the hospital?" Jenny didn't hesitate and quickly picked Tommy up, preparing to leave. But Richard stopped her, his face blank. "Jenny, let's call off our engagement." Jenny didn't believe him at all, thinking it was just a tactic, and with a dismissive wave she said, "Come on, cut it out with these silly games. Just stay home and think about what you did." When Jenny finished speaking, she hurriedly left with Michael and his son. As soon as the door closed, Richard felt utterly drained of all his energy. He held the painting and slowly squatted down, as if holding his own little world. His eyes filled with warmth that moistened his heart and made it hard to breathe, making everything go dark before him. He wasn't sure how long he sat there before his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a friend request from Michael. Richard accepted it but received no message back. Then a message popped up from a colleague. "Hey Richard, I've got something on social media that I need likes for. Can you help me out and give it a like?" Richard exited the message and scrolled through his feed. He stumbled upon a recent post from Michael that caught his eye. It was a series of photos of Jenny sitting by Tommy's hospital bed, peeling an apple, with the caption, "Thankful to have you by my side." Richard clicked in, only to realize it was a live photo with the background sound on. He could clearly hear Michael and Jenny's conversation. Michael sounded a bit worried. "Jenny, do you think it'll be okay with Richard?" I saw him packing earlier. What if he gets mad and moves out? Jenny replied carelessly, almost mocking. He's just an orphan. Where else could he go? He might just run off elsewhere for surgery. I've seen this act before. Richard shut off his phone and closed his eyes with a wry smile. How pitiable he was. The moments she once stood in front of him now felt like boomerangs piercing his heart and weakness. During the following week, Richard drowned himself in work at the hospital and didn't return home at all. He really was busy, not only needing to clear out his surgery schedule, but a major fire had also occurred in the city, drastically increasing the number of surgical patients. All the surgeons were running themselves ragged. Great work, Richard. His coworker nodded at him as he took off his mask and changed out of his scrubs. Before he could take a sip of water, Michael and Tommy showed up. Richard, please, don't kick me and Tommy out, Michael pleaded, pulling his son to kneel in front of the desk before the young nurse could even leave the office. He wasn't wearing makeup today and looked worn out, fragile as ever. His tears were gut-wrenching to witness. The young nurse was shocked and quickly closed the door behind her as she left. Richard remained seated at his desk, unmoved, his expression stern. Jenny's not here. What's with this performance? Michael continued sobbing, his voice full of grievance. Richard, I know you dislike me, but I never intended to compete with you for Jenny. We don't know anyone here in H-City. We just need a place to stay temporarily. We'll leave even. But now you've had us thrown out of Jenny's place. How are we supposed to live? Growing impatient, Richard retorted. I never. Before he could finish, the phone on his desk rang. It was Jenny's grandfather calling. Richard, are you busy? The kind voice of the old man on the other end made Richard soften his tone. Not really, just finished surgery. Jenny's grandfather had watched Richard grow up and treated him like his own grandson. Richard depended on him dearly, considering him and his own grandfather as the ones who loved him most. Sensing Richard's exhaustion, her grandfather urged him not to overwork himself before getting to the point. Richard, I've heard about what's going on between you and Jenny. Don't worry, I've dealt with that man Michael for you. I had my men throw his things out of Jenny's house and kicked him out. From the very start, and always, you were meant to be my granddaughter's husband. Richard was stunned, glancing at Michael kneeling before him. So, it was Jenny's grandfather who had him thrown out. His heart softened with gratitude, yet his mouth tasted bitter. Clutching the phone, he remained speechless for a while until the old man sighed and pleaded gently. Richard, I know Jenny's been going too far lately, but I still hope you can give her another chance. She's merely been fooled by him. Once you two marry, she'll come around. How about setting the wedding for next month? Feeling a lump in his throat, Richard made up a random excuse and ended the call. As the screen turned black, the office door was flung open again. Jenny stormed in, rushing to help Michael and his son as soon as she saw them kneeling. When she turned to Richard, her gaze was sharp and cold. Richard, you're not a kid anymore, and yet you're tattling. Now you get to marry me, so are you happy? This scheming of yours makes me sick. She dropped the words before storming out with Michael and his son without another glance. Richard chuckled cynically, leaning back in his chair with closed eyes. Well, so be it, he thought. He'd be leaving soon anyway. He thought his departure would mean never seeing Jenny and Michael again. But that night, Tommy was rushed into the ER, covered in blood, with Jenny and Michael by his side. All three had been in a car accident, but Tommy was the most severely injured. Michael was frantic, grabbing Richard's hand as soon as he arrived. Richard, you have to save Tommy. Being the doctor on duty, Richard couldn't refuse and went straight into surgery. It was a simple procedure and he finished it quickly. However, after the observation period, Tommy showed no signs of waking up and remained in a coma. The next day, upon hearing the news, Richard immediately visited their room. Jenny was out, leaving Michael alone by Tommy's side. Seeing Richard, Michael's eyes reddened as he frantically accused. Richard, why hasn't Tommy woken up? Did you do something to him? I know you hate me, but you can't harm my son. Uncertain of the problem, Richard moved to check on Tommy, but Michael blocked his way, crying and yelling, Enough. Don't touch my Tommy anymore. You botched the surgery on purpose. I want a new doctor. A new one. Intent on understanding Tommy's condition, Richard didn't argue and simply pressed the call button. Facing Michael, he said, "You can ask for another doctor, but you have to find out why Tommy is still in a coma. I won't take the blame for a surgical error." Once the nurse arrived, Richard ordered some tests. Take a blood sample from the patient immediately and check if there's a possibility of the patient taking medication before surgery that conflicted with the anesthesia. Before he could finish, Michael burst out in agitation, breaking in, "No, I won't allow it. My son didn't take anything, and he's not sick. This is clearly your surgical error. Why draw blood from my son?" Genuine tears fell as he continued to sob. Richard watched his unnatural demeanor, sensing something wasn't right. Fixing his eyes on Michael, Richard questioned coldly, "Are you hiding Tommy's medical history?" Michael's eyes flickered, his voice rising defensively. "What hidden history? I'm Tommy's father. How could I harm him?" Recalling the recent incident where Michael shoved Tommy, causing a head wound, Richard's suspicion grew stronger. There was no use arguing further. The test results would reveal the truth. Richard addressed the nurse firmly. "Draw the blood." Michael gritted his teeth and moved to block. "No, you can't. I'm his guardian, and I say no." Richard restrained him, allowing the nurse to quickly draw the sample and rush out of the room. Afterwards, Michael suddenly fell to the floor as Richard released him, and was then abruptly shoved aside by a much stronger force. "Michael!" Jenny rushed over to help Michael. "Are you okay?" she asked. Then she turned to Richard, her eyes filled with anger. "Richard, we're in a hospital. You're a doctor. What do you think you're doing to a patient's family? Did your professionalism just get thrown out the window?" Before Richard could reply, Michael urgently tugged at Jenny's sleeve, crying, "Jenny, you have to help Tommy. He's past the observation period and hasn't woken up. This has got to be a surgical error. What if Tommy doesn't wake up?" Richard was just ordering tests to find the cause, insisting he wouldn't take the blame. "But does that mean my Tommy has to pay for his mistake and just not wake up?" Richard almost laughed from sheer exasperation, trying to explain, "The test results will confirm." "Enough!" Jenny shouted, cutting him off. Disappointment filled her eyes. "Richard, I can't believe you'd do this intentionally. When did you become so cruel? Hurting a little kid like that, no way are you doing surgery again. You shouldn't even be a doctor." Richard looked at Jenny in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Jenny just held Michael tightly and called loudly toward the door. The assistant quickly entered, and Jenny instructed her, "Take him there for some serious reflection. With the wedding coming up, just get him a leave from the hospital and handle things." Reflect on what? Why always believe Michael when he's wrong? Seeing about to grab him, Richard couldn't take it anymore and shouted, "Don't touch me. I'm not leaving. I need to stay here until the test results come back. I did the surgery, and I'm not denying it." His words cut short as a sharp pain hit his neck and everything went black. Richard was still locked up in the villa by Jenny. It was far from the city, surrounded by layers of security and signal jammers. He couldn't even use his phone to call for help. A week into his confinement, the power suddenly went out one night. Before Richard could react, his phone rang in the dark. He picked up quickly. The voice on the other end was anxious. "Richard, finally you answered. You need to get to the rehabilitation center. Your grandfather's not doing well. Get over here now, you might still see him one last time." The words echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, hitting him hard. His hands trembled so much he nearly dropped the phone. After hanging up, he threw on his coat and started dashing out. He had to see his grandfather one last time. Rushing downstairs, he got to the door only to have the guards stop him. "Richard, Jenny's orders, you can't leave." Desperate, Richard pushed against the hands blocking him, shouting, "My grandfather's critically ill. Let me out now." The guards looked at each other but eventually shook their heads. "Richard, we can't help you. Jenny's orders are firm. Try calling Jenny. If she says you can go, we won't stop you." Eyes red with desperation, Richard hurriedly dialed Jenny's number, nearly fumbling it in his haste. First call, no answer. Second call, no answer. Third call, a couple of rings, and then it went to the busy tone. Jenny saw his calls and decided to ignore them. Feeling her heart drop, eyes burning from unshed tears, Richard slumped to the floor with his phone. What about Grandpa? He couldn't bear not seeing him one last time, the person he loved most. Dragging himself up, Richard tried to rush outside again. The guards quickly intercepted. Richard, you mustn't go. Let me go. I need to see my grandfather. Let me go. Chaos erupted at the villa's entrance, and at that moment, the sound of a car pulling up broke through the commotion. Through his tear-blurred vision, Richard saw Jenny's grandfather appear. Unable to hold back, he broke down, sobbing, "Grandpa, please take me to see my grandfather one last time." The miller's car raced to its limits. But by the time they reached Ching Shan Sanatorium, 40 minutes had passed. Richard ran anxiously into the ward, but all he saw was a nurse covering his grandfather's face with a white cloth. He stopped, looked on in disbelief, and chuckled. "What are you doing? Don't cover it too high. Grandpa can't breathe if you do that in his sleep." Walking over slowly, he gently pulled the white cloth away. His grandfather's face came into view, still kind and gentle, but the once warm hand had turned cold, and his body had grown stiff. As a doctor, Richard knew human physiology better than anyone. He knew for sure his grandfather was gone, but he couldn't believe it, and he didn't want to believe it. Richard held his grandfather's hand to his cheek, as if that could warm him back to life. He spoke softly. "Grandpa, Richard is here. Why won't you open your eyes and look at me?" But the only answer was the silence of the room. The gentle voice would never come again. Even the young nurse couldn't bear to watch Richard like this and gently said, "Your grandfather passed about 30 minutes ago. I saw how hard you tried to get here, but maybe it was just meant to be." Before he went, the old gentleman said one thing. He hoped that his Richard would always be happy. With those words, the nurse left, giving Richard some space. A moment later, the heart-wrenching screams echoed through the room. Afterwards, Jenny's grandfather helped Richard with all the arrangements for the cremation. By the time Jenny found out about it, the funeral was already over. She rushed to the scene, arriving just as Richard, dressed all in black, was coming out. Even without any makeup, he stood there with an incredible beauty, fragile and seeming like he might break any moment. Jenny suddenly felt panicked, hurrying over to him to explain. "Richard, are you okay? I didn't mean to ignore your calls. I didn't know. Tommy woke up and I was with Michael." Richard interrupted quietly, "It's fine. It's all over." The word over panicked Jenny even more. She grabbed his arm, forcing a smile. "Richard, I was wrong this time. You've always wanted to go to El Country to ride a hot air balloon, right? Your birthday's coming up. Let's go and have fun. Okay? Right now, let's go home." Without waiting for an answer, Jenny took Richard by the arm, leading him to the car. Once home, Jenny couldn't rest easy. She secretly arranged guards to watch the house, afraid Richard might leave. But Richard hadn't shown any unusual behavior. He agreed to go with Jenny to El Country and was busy packing his stuff. 3 days later, they headed to the airport together. Looking at the 2 suitcases in front of her, Jenny was a bit surprised. "Why are you bringing so much stuff?" Richard kept a calm expression. "I want to stay for a while." Jenny didn't suspect anything, smiling, "Sure, whatever makes you happy." On the way to the airport, Jenny's phone rang repeatedly, but she ignored every call. Richard noticed but didn't say anything. At check-in, Jenny glanced at her phone and suddenly looked alarmed. "Richard, something's wrong with Tommy. You go ahead to El Country. I'll handle it and catch up with you." With those words, she turned and left quickly, without a second thought. Richard watched as she disappeared into the crowd, moving in the opposite direction. He pulled out a ticket for Sea City from his bag and whispered, "Goodbye, Jenny." Just before boarding, Richard received a message from Michael. "Pretty angry, huh? She chose me after all." "Angry?" Richard smirked slightly. "Not really. Who hasn't fallen for a jerk or two in their youth?" Swiftly deleting Michael's contact, Richard turned off his phone, waiting for the plane to take off. Jenny, the bidding this time was a breeze. Thanks to you and me. Here's to us. Casually clinking glasses with a partner, Jenny downed her glass of wine before tugging at her collar in annoyance. Her eyes glanced at her phone screen. It was already 3:30 p.m. Richard should have landed in L Country by now, right? Why hasn't he messaged her to check in? Is he still mad? Jenny, frazzled, suddenly heard a ding. A message alert. Picking it up, she saw it was from Michael. Jenny, don't drink too much at business events. Take care of yourself. The smile faded from Jenny's face, for the first time leaving Michael's message unanswered. Excusing herself to the restroom, she headed to the hallway, ready to call Richard, when a familiar face appeared. Jenny, eating here too? Huh? Looking up, Jenny recognized Richard's boss William and nodded politely. Remembering something Richard mentioned to him, William cheerfully said, I haven't seen you around lately. Congratulations on marrying Richard. You two have been through a lot since you were kids. It's no small feat to make it to this point. Jenny was about to smile and respond when something felt off. Married already? No way. She and Richard haven't even had their wedding yet. Feeling uneasy, Jenny forced a smile and said, You must be mistaken. Richard and I aren't married yet. William was surprised. Nonsense. Richard told me nearly 2 weeks ago that he got married and was leaving his job. Then it hit him, and he laughed. Oh, maybe I misunderstood. He must be preparing for your wedding in advance. But Jenny didn't feel reassured by this explanation. She felt even more anxious. 2 weeks ago? She never agreed to marry Richard. Why did he say he was married? To whom? Why quit his job? Where is he going? Numerous questions bombarded her mind, making her heart sink into despair. Panicking, she quickly asked, What exactly did Richard say? Before she could finish, someone emerged from the room next door. Hey, William, how long does it take to go to the bathroom? Hurry. Everyone's waiting for you. The person said this while pulling William back inside. William gave Jenny an apologetic smile before turning to leave. Still filled with unanswered questions, Jenny stood there feeling increasingly anxious, too distracted to socialize. She didn't return to the room, but strode out of the restaurant. Telling her assistant to drive her home immediately, Jenny tried calling Richard repeatedly during the ride. Hello, the number you've dialed is currently unavailable. After dozens of attempts, every call went straight to voicemail. Jenny clenched her teeth and sent Richard a message. Richard, haven't you reached L Country yet? Why haven't you messaged me? Are you still upset? I can explain what happened today. Please call me as soon as you see this. I'm really worried about you. Stop messing around. Okay? She kept refreshing her screen, filling it with green, but still, no response from him. Back at home, Jenny hurried to Richard's room. Richard's just traveling, that's all, just traveling. But when she opened the door and found the room empty, with his closet stripped bare, she froze in disbelief. A thought she couldn't accept surfaced. Had he really left? Yet she quickly shook her head. This had to be another of his pranks. Richard wouldn't leave her. Gritting her teeth, she told her assistant, Find out where Richard went. Richard's plane landed at 4 p.m. It should have arrived in Sea City by 2, but a sudden snowstorm delayed the flight by 2 hours. Stepping outside, large snowflakes were still falling. Winter in H City isn't this cold, nor does it snow. Richard was wearing only a cashmere coat, and the wind pierced right through. Wow, so cold. He breathed into his hands for warmth, but before he could pull out his phone, a warm coat landed on him. You should have dressed warmer, came a familiar voice, dispelling the surrounding chill. Richard looked up to see a vibrant red in front of him. Annie handed him a rose with a smile. I didn't know what flowers you liked, so I got roses. Is that too cliché? The biting cold, mixed with the fresh scent of roses, hit his senses, as did Annie's clean presence. His heart unexpectedly softened. Richard shook his head, holding the bouquet tightly. I really like them. Annie's lips curled into a smile. She naturally took Richard's suitcase and wrapped an arm around his shoulder. Let's get in the car. Okay? It's warm inside, won't be so cold. Once inside, The warmth made Richard realize how numb his cheeks had become from the cold. He looked at Annie after a moment. "Thanks for picking me up." Before boarding, Richard had messaged Annie about arriving in C-City today. Since they'd agreed she'd come to H-City to get him in a month, it was better to tell her he had come early, preventing any unnecessary wait. To his surprise, Annie called minutes later, asking about his arrival time and saying she would pick him up. Feeling like he'd inconvenienced Annie, making her wait so long, Richard apologized. "Today's flight delay kept you waiting, didn't it? Sorry for taking your time." Annie dismissed it with a laugh. "Waiting for my husband doesn't waste my time. I stayed warm in my car anyway." In a black turtleneck, her left hand resting lazily on the steering wheel, her gaze shifted toward him with a unique mix of elegance and kindness. Richard was momentarily stunned, hurriedly avoiding her gaze, as a soft flush tinged his pale ears. What husband? Even though they were technically married, she sure got used to saying it fast. Annie enjoyed his expression, but chose not to tease further, starting the car instead. "Hungry? I'll take you to eat first, then we can go home." Not knowing what Richard wanted, Annie picked a restaurant that served H-City-style cuisine. After ordering, they sat across from each other in silence. For some reason, Richard felt awkward and stood to excuse himself. "I'm going to the restroom." Annie nodded with a smile. "Okay, I'll be right here." Richard left the room feeling awkward, almost tripping over his own feet, forgetting his phone. Annie watched him leave, her attention caught by his phone ringing on the table. Someone was calling Richard. Initially uninterested in answering, the persistent calls made it clear something urgent might be up, so she decided to pick up. "Hello?" Silence followed, so Annie asked again. "Hello?" Finally, the angry voice of a woman came through. "Who are you? Where's Richard? Why are you answering his phone?" The woman's demanding tone was irritating, so Annie narrowed her eyes, coolly replying, "I'm his wife." "Who are you?" As she spoke, she noticed Richard at the room entrance. She handed him the phone. "Your phone kept ringing. I answered in case it was urgent." Seeing the caller ID, Richard was surprised. Meeting Annie's gaze, he was at a loss for words. Some things can't be explained in a few sentences, but as his wife, Annie had a right to know. But how to start? Understanding his hesitation, Annie reassured him, pressing the phone into his hand. "Whatever it's about, we'll talk later. Take the call now. If you don't want me hearing it, I'll step outside." With that, Annie turned to leave. At the last moment, Richard stopped her. Seeing her surprised expression, he reassured her. "There's nothing you can't hear." Then he put the call on speaker. Jenny's shout came loud and clear. Richard took a deep breath. "What do you want? What's with the delay, Richard?" Jenny's voice held a tinge of relief but quickly turned somber. "Where did you go? Why haven't you returned my calls? And who was that woman? I sent you so many messages you didn't answer. Are you still throwing a tantrum?" Her tone escalated into a near scream by the end. Even through the phone, Richard could picture Jenny's irritated expression. She's probably again upset about her precious time being wasted, annoyed by unimportant matters. A quiet, fleeting sense of irony brushed past him, without stirring any real feeling. In a calm voice, Richard replied, "Jenny, I got married. The woman who answered is my wife." Jenny could hardly believe it, thinking he was messing around, softening her tone to explain. "Richard, drop the act. I know you're upset that I left you today, but Michael and I are nothing more. I'm just grateful since he saved my life. You're my future husband. Can't you just be a bit more accepting?" "I'm not making a scene," Richard said seriously. "Jenny, I'm on my honeymoon with my wife. Please don't call." Jenny was losing her patience and raised her voice. "Richard, is this just a ploy to get my attention?" Just then, Susan's voice came over the phone. "Jenny, I found Richard's flight details." The sound of papers rustled, and Jenny calmed down. "Are you in City C now? Wait for me. I'll find you and talk in person." Feeling certain Richard was just trying to get her attention, she started lecturing him. "Richard, I'm tired of your games. And using marriage as an excuse for you and William to leave your jobs is childish. Do you think I would believe you married someone else? You're an orphan. Who else would marry you but me? She paused, realizing she'd crossed a line, and quickly tried to backtrack. Richard, that's not what I meant earlier. But Richard didn't want to listen anymore. He hung up and blocked her everywhere. His heart pounded. He looked down, trying to steady his breath, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. 6 years, and he finally heard Jenny's true thoughts. So, because he was an orphan with no family to rely on, she had felt entitled to treat him poorly, dragging out their engagement. All those past excuses weren't genuine. She believed he'd never leave because no one else would marry him. It was disgusting. How did the sweet girl he remembered become so rotten? His body started to shake with nausea, his vision darkening as he nearly fell from his chair. But the anticipated pain didn't come. A warm, strong hand gripped his shoulder and pulled him into a comforting embrace. Are you okay? Do you need to go to the hospital? Annie asked, her voice full of concern. Richard leaned into her, certain she wore a worried expression without even seeing her face. His new wife was different from Jenny. The anger inside him slowly evaporated. Richard slowly sat up and shook his head at Annie. I'm fine. Maybe just a bit of low blood sugar. He hesitated before saying, the person who called was my ex-fiancée. She doesn't know about our marriage yet. After explaining everything, Richard looked at Annie, waiting for her reaction. Their marriage had been a quick solution to family pressure. If she felt deceived and wanted a divorce, he wouldn't blame her. Annie looked serious, holding his gaze for a long moment. Richard's heart tightened, but she simply asked, do you still have feelings for her? Richard was stunned. She wasn't angry or accusatory. After a moment, he shook his head. It's over between us. But if you're concerned, why would I be? Annie raised her brows with a relaxed smile. It'd be odd for a man like you not to have an ex, and you've moved on. Now you're my husband. Even if she tried to compete, she wouldn't stand a chance. Richard, drawn in by Annie's easy demeanor, added, why not? Because I won't give her the chance to take you. Annie whispered confidently, plus we're in a military marriage. Breaking it is serious trouble. Richard flushed under Annie's gaze, instinctively looking away. But her demeanor comforted him, easing his tension. Richard thought back to the call, hesitated, and asked Annie, if it's possible, could you help me hide my tracks? I don't want her interrupting our life together. Annie was visibly pleased by his use of our and replied warmly, if you don't want her around, I won't let her disturb you. She handed him a cup of hot water. Was your stomach upset earlier? A little warmth might help. I'll check on our food. Eating should make you feel better. Watching the steam from the glass fog his vision, Richard's eyes grew misty as he saw Annie speaking with the waiter. His nose tingled with emotion. Returning to her seat, Annie cleared her throat to get Richard's attention. Do you have any requests regarding the wedding? Richard didn't meet her eyes, simply shook his head. The only person he truly wanted at his wedding was gone. So it no longer mattered how the wedding was. None of it mattered now. Sensing Richard's low spirits, Annie leaned in with an apologetic tone. Time is tight, and a military wedding might be simple. I'm sorry for that, but we should still invite those who matter. You once said your grandfather was why you married me. This wedding should be witnessed by him. Her words hit Richard hard. He hadn't expected Annie to remember his words. Someone else in the world still remembered his grandfather. Tears fell as he looked at Annie, sobbing like a child. But he can't come. They kept me from him. I got there too late. I never even got to show him our marriage certificate. His grief was overwhelming, and Annie hugged him tight, comforting him. From his broken story, Annie pieced together the truth. Learning that Jenny had kept Richard from seeing his grandfather one last time infuriated Annie. Despite soothing Richard, she sent a text message. Elsewhere, a bottle clattered to the floor. Jenny sat on the ground, her face flushed, downing another glass of burning liquor, clutching her head in agony. It was the 3rd day since Richard left, and she hadn't found any trace of him. Although Susan had found his flight details, he hadn't checked into a hotel. Searching for him in a city like C was nearly impossible. At first, Jenny was confident Richard was just playing hard to get, certain he wouldn't leave her. But days passed and she started to doubt. "Richard, where are you?" she muttered, reaching for another bottle. A noise at the door, and Michael's voice came in. "Jenny, you've had too much." Michael took the bottle from her hands, his voice full of concern. "I know you're upset about Richard, but seeing you like this hurts me. I know your feelings for him run deep. I shouldn't say this, but if you're going to love someone who loves you back. Someone who truly loves you wouldn't let you hurt yourself like this." Michael, not mentioning Richard directly, consistently undermined him. He wanted to imply he was the one who truly loved Jenny, who valued her most. Whether drunk or convinced, Jenny didn't respond, eyes downcast. Michael felt encouraged and leaned in. "Come on, Jenny, the floor's cold. Let me help you up." Dressed up with his shirt's top buttons undone, his toned chest was on display, inviting. But as he reached for her, Jenny suddenly pushed him away. "Don't touch me." Stunned, Michael fell, arms scraping the floor, staring at her in disbelief. But Jenny showed no concern, not helping him up, impatiently frowned. "I'll find you a new place. Move out and don't come back." Richard never liked Michael moving in, and now that she kicked him out, maybe Richard would come back. Michael couldn't believe his ears. Jenny wanted him to move out? Why? This was not how he had imagined things. He had driven Richard away, and with him out of the picture, he expected nothing to stand between him and Jenny. He should have been happier. Why had everything changed instead? With his fists clenched, Michael felt a surge of unwillingness and wanted to talk to Jenny again. But Jenny wasn't listening. She held her head and wobbled away, ready to return to her room. Just then, her phone rang in her pocket. It was Susan calling. "Jenny, we found Richard." All the alcohol in Jenny evaporated, and she asked quickly, "Where is he?" After that day, Richard had been staying with Annie at the military quarters. They were busy shopping for many things as their wedding approached. "Next, shall we check out the bedding?" Sitting in the passenger seat, Richard pulled out a long list and sighed. "I had no idea preparing for a wedding would be this overwhelming." Richard didn't have any elders, and Annie had lost her parents early, leaving just a grandfather, who was in Beijing. They had no elder to help them prepare, so they had to arrange everything themselves, and after 3 days, they weren't even halfway through the list. As Annie drove, she gave Richard a playful look. "Tired? I can handle the preparations myself. You could rest at home." Recently, Richard had gotten more comfortable around Annie, so he joked with her, "I don't trust your tomboy sense of style. I don't want a room covered in Pepto-Bismol pink switch plates." Annie wasn't offended by Richard teasing her. She raised an eyebrow and said, "See, that's typical. It's practical." Richard chuckled, looking out the window, feeling his stress melt away. After finalizing their bedding choices, Richard was about to head to the furniture store when Annie suddenly pulled him into a cafe. "Wait here. I'll be right back." With that, she hurried off, leaving Richard puzzled. He ordered a drink and sat by the window, waiting obediently. It wasn't long before he heard footsteps behind him. "Back so soon?" Richard turned around, surprised, but the smile instantly froze when he saw Jenny standing there. She stood in front of him, eyes red, hair messy, and her suit all wrinkled, looking nothing like the polished professional she used to be. Jenny didn't care about the stares from others. Her eyes full of eagerness, she moved to grab his hand. "Richard, I finally found you. Let's go back home." But Richard stepped back, avoiding her touch, and coldly asked, "Why are you here?" With that one simple question, Jenny felt like she was plunged into ice. She stood frozen, not daring to move, shocked by his cold tone after searching so tirelessly for him. She always thought of Richard as playing hard to get, but seeing his expression, she realized he genuinely didn't want her there. Jenny felt panic rising, and with a forced smile, gently pleaded, "Richard, can we go home? I've made Michael leave. He won't bother you anymore." Frowning, Richard couldn't understand why Jenny was acting like this. When he was by her side, she had always disregarded him, even hurting him for another guy. And now, after he had moved on, she was asking for him back? Wasn't that absurd? Not wanting to be a spectacle for the curious onlookers, Richard pointed to the opposite seat. Sit down. Let's talk. Hearing his words, Jenny felt a bit relieved and sat down. She thought the problem was all about Michael, and if she could resolve it, everything would be fine. Once calm, Jenny assured him, Richard, I promise I'll handle the Michael situation. He won't anger you anymore. If he bothers you, I'll send him back to the States. Looking straight at her, Richard clarified, Jenny, it's not about him. We're over. Jenny couldn't accept his words and raised her voice. Who said we're over? We're engaged. We're fiancés. Growing more certain, she moved to grab his hand, pleading, Richard, come back with me. I'll never upset you again. My grandfather already set the wedding date. You always listen to him, right? Richard pulled away and calmly said, Unfortunately, we can't get married anymore. What do you mean? Jenny's lips trembled as Richard showed her his phone. 2 marriage certificates were displayed, their bold red color piercing her eyes like daggers. I told you I'm already married. Become paralyzed, Jenny grabbed at the phone, unwilling to believe it. This can't be real. You photoshopped this, right? This isn't funny. Trying to dismiss it as fake, the steel seal, date, and official certification stared back at her, undeniable. There was also a genuine photo of him and another woman, smiling happily. He really was married to someone else? Jenny sat hopelessly as her temper flared. In rage, she smashed Richard's phone to the floor, shattering it to pieces. Richard watched her meltdown, a touch of anger flashing in his gaze. Jenny, have you lost your mind? But Jenny didn't care about anything anymore. She clung desperately to Richard, pulling him toward the door. I won't accept this. Divorce her. We'll get married right now. You're my fiancé. You can't be with someone else. What on earth are you saying? Let go. Richard struggled, but Jenny, like someone who's lost reason, swiftly dragged him out of the cafe. Let go of me. Jenny, I'm not going. Even as Richard fought back, his shoe got caught, twisting his foot painfully. As the pain shot through, Richard almost fell, but Jenny kept dragging him along. Passers-by watched, whispering, but no one dared intervene. Just as Richard was about to shout, he was suddenly pulled into someone's arms. An angry voice cut through the chaos. Who said you could touch him? Looking up, Richard saw Annie's tense expression. Before he could speak, the pain from his ankle forced him to let out a groan. Annie glanced at him, concerned. Did you twist it? Carefully, she helped him to a nearby bench, opened a box in her hand, and swapped his shoes for more comfortable sneakers. Feeling relief in his foot, Richard was taken aback. You bought shoes for me back there? Annie looked sympathetically at his swollen ankle and casually remarked, wearing such tough shoes, I just thought of getting you a new pair. Didn't expect you'd run into someone without eyes on your trip out. After saying that, Annie stood up, glaring at Jenny with a sharp look. She coldly rebuked, his ankle is sprained. Didn't you see? You want him to go with you? Is this how you treat him well? Jenny recognized Annie from the marriage certificate photo instantly, and her gaze turned icy. Despite feeling guilty for Richard's injury, she held her ground. Richard is my fiancé. Our issues are none of your business. Fiancé? Annie sneered and firmly clung to Richard's shoulder. Too bad. Now he's my husband. Surrounded by onlookers, Richard blushed deeply, tugging at Annie's sleeve and whispering, All right, that's enough. Annie squeezed his hand, smirking. What are you afraid of? We're legally married. It's not like I'm some mistress. Jenny watched their closeness, anger burning like fire inside her. Annie's comment about being the mistress hit a nerve. Unable to bear it any longer, Jenny shouted, Let go, and lunged at Annie. Annie wasn't scared at all. She stepped forward and fought back. The difference between someone used to the office and someone who trains is evident. Annie quickly subdued Jenny. Jenny was in pain, and in a final attempt, threw a punch, only to strike Annie's face, grazing her mouth. Seeing Annie hurt, Richard rushed over, cradling her face. Are you okay? Does it hurt? Annie tried to smile and reassure him but winced from the pain. Watching her, Richard couldn't control his anger. He looked at Jenny and said furiously, "Why are you still pretending? Attacking someone like that, are you crazy?" Jenny, stunned by Richard's rebuke, felt incredibly wronged. Though Annie's hits were strategic, Jenny's face was unscathed, but her body ached all over. Annie could have dodged that punch but took it on purpose. "It's a trick." As if to confirm Jenny's thoughts, Annie stood behind Richard, flashing her a challenging smile. Jenny was infuriated, forcing herself up. "Richard, she's faking it, just to get your sympathy." Seeing her stepping forward, Richard blocked her. "If you make a move, I'm calling the police." Watching him defend another woman so strenuously, Jenny felt as if a knife was piercing her heart. Clutching her aching ribs, she laughed bitterly. "Richard, you're leaving me for her? You're from a prestigious family, and what is she? Penniless girl, what can she give you?" Moving to grab Richard's hand, he immediately brushed it off. "You're busy managing billion-dollar deals. My wife is busy serving the country. Yet she finds time for me and is completely devoted. That's what she offers, and that's the difference." Richard looked at her coldly, as if staring at a stranger. "We're done, Jenny. Let's not meet again." With that, Richard took Annie's hand. "Let's go." They turned and left. As Jenny stumbled, trying to follow, "Richard, wait." Her phone buzzed just then. Assistant Susan calling. "Jenny, you need to come back. There's a problem with the company." Jenny paused, frowning. What happened? Meanwhile, in a car, he watched Annie pull a small first aid kit from the trunk. Annie found some ointment and was about to apply it when Richard, feeling awkward, stopped her. "I can do it myself." Annie avoided his grasp, teasing, "Your ankle's pretty swollen, and it needs a good massage. You know that, right, Dr.?" Richard pursed his lips, knowing she was right, but letting her work on his ankle made him uneasy. Suddenly, Annie leaned toward him, whispering, "Aren't you shy?" Her face loomed close, her low voice mesmerizing. Richard quickly lowered his head, stuttering, "Who said I'm shy?" Annie was waiting for this, grinned triumphantly. "Great. Since you're not shy, let's get started." Saying so, she rubbed on the ointment, gripping his ankle. Richard was caught off guard by the pain, his eyes tearing up. Seeing him suffering, Annie softened her movements. "Hang in there. Once the swelling's gone, it'll hurt less." The pain gradually faded. Looking at Annie's focused expression, Richard was reminded of his unasked question from earlier. "How did you know my shoe size?" Puzzled Richard. He hadn't known Annie for even a month. How did she know his shoe size? Without stopping her massage, Annie responded as if it was a simple question. "By looking at your shoes, of course. Since we're married, I should know more about you. I checked out your preferences. You like grapes, strawberries, hate bananas, love white, despise yellow, and your birthday is March 22nd. Her head down, her mellow voice resonated in Richard's heart. He was surprised she knew so much about his likes and dislikes, and accurately, too. Annie looked up and smiled. "Am I right?" Richard's heart softened, whispering, "You're right." Turns out, understanding someone isn't about how long you've been together, but about how much you care. 20 days isn't short, but 20 years isn't long, either. Those with a heart will understand. Those without cannot be taught. Annie was genuinely trying to treat him well. He used to think they were simply a timely match, a modest couple at best, possibly ending quickly. But now, Annie was working to make this relationship more meaningful. Richard recalled his grandfather's words. "Richard, what kind of person should you marry to be happy? There are two types of women. Those I love and those who love me. No, you choose a good person. Love fades. Only with someone responsible and patient will you find happiness." At the time, Richard didn't understand his grandfather's advice, but now he thought he might. Annie finished massaging his ankle. Though still swollen, it would hurt less in the coming days. Looking at his reddened ankle, feeling Annie's residual warmth, Richard felt a bit sheepish. "Why do you have a first aid kit in your car?" Annie snapped the lid shut. "Sometimes missions can be dangerous. Treating yourself fast can save your life." Her casual tone belied the risks. making Richard anxious. Are your missions always this dangerous? Hearing this, Annie pressed a hand beside him, enclosing him with a low chuckle. Worried about me? Huh, hubby? Her charming eyes sparkled like stars, captivating him. She was constantly teasing him. There was nowhere to hide. Richard, a bit embarrassed and annoyed, felt like a cat whose fur had been ruffled. He stepped closer. Weren't you the one who said we should get to know each other better? He stopped abruptly, eyes wide open. His lips felt a wetness that disappeared almost instantly. Annie licked her lips. Her eyes held an alluring, almost predatory look. Oops, couldn't resist. Richard covered his mouth and leaned back in the car seat, his heart pounding like a drum. Did Annie just kiss him? The atmosphere in the car turned intimate in a flash. Richard blushed fiercely, staring at Annie wordlessly. Annie didn't move either, a lazy smile creeping up her face, much like a cat that stole cream. The silence was broken by Annie's phone ringing. She answered the call and stepped out of the car. Richard watched as Annie's expression turned serious while she talked on the phone. All right, I understand. Annie hung up, came back to Richard, and ushered him to the passenger seat. Sitting in the driver's seat, Annie gave him an apologetic look. Sorry, we might have to postpone the wedding. Let me take you home first. Richard, a bit anxious, asked, Is it a mission? Annie started the car. Yeah, there's some unrest in City J. I need to go investigate secretly. You wait for me in City C. Okay? Before she could finish, Richard grabbed her hand. Surprised, Annie looked at him as he softly said, Take me with you this time. I can be your first aid kit. On the other side, Jenny was having a tough time. By the time she flew back to City H, it was already 6 p.m. After commuting 2 flights and all the running around, Jenny was exhausted. She didn't have time to rest and headed straight to the company to check on things. Even though Susan had briefly told her what happened, once Jenny got the full picture, it was worse than she imagined. The company's main project was stuck, partners wanted to withdraw, and even their usually supportive bank was pulling back on their agreed loan. While trying to soothe these concerns, the shareholders also got wind of the trouble. Worrying about their dividends, they demanded Jenny give an explanation. So, Jenny called a late-night board meeting, pleading with the shareholders for more time to resolve the crisis. After 2 hectic days, the situation began to stabilize. Jenny could finally spare some time. Just as she was about to find Richard, Michael called her. Jenny held a bit of a grudge against Michael because of Richard leaving. But remembering how Michael had once saved her, she couldn't be too harsh. Hesitating a bit, she answered the call. Over the phone, Michael's voice was hopeful. Jenny, Tommy is awake. He's asking for you. Could you come see him? Tommy got hurt because of her and Jenny felt guilty, so she agreed. In the hospital room, Michael put down an apple and approached Jenny as she arrived. Jenny, you're here. Yeah, Jenny replied, glancing at the still sleeping Tommy, and frowned. I thought he wanted to see me, but he's asleep. Michael felt a bit disgruntled but forced a smile. Would I lie to you? He woke up earlier, just nodded off again. Looking at Jenny's weary state, he added, You've lost weight. Is it because of Richard? Michael gave her that same sympathetic look, the one that always seemed to work before. Yet this time, Jenny felt annoyed. It's none of your business. If Tommy isn't awake, I've got work to handle, she said, turning to leave. Michael, not ready to let her go, desperately grabbed her arm. Jenny, watch Tommy for a bit, okay? I need to get some hot water. The room needs someone to look after, especially with a nurse coming to change the drip. Jenny didn't want to stay but couldn't leave the kid unattended, so she agreed. After Michael left, a nurse came to change the 4. Watching Tommy, Jenny suddenly remembered something and casually asked the nurse about the surgery mistake with Richard. No long-term effects for Tommy, right? Thinking it was a routine question, Jenny didn't expect to provoke the nurse's ire. The nurse tossed the supplies onto the tray, glaring. Who told you it was a surgical mistake? That boy's in a coma because his family hid his congenital heart defect. They didn't tell us, so he got too much anesthesia. Jenny was floored. It wasn't a surgical error? How's that possible? With a big eye roll, the nurse replied, possible? Richard noticed something wrong and I drew the blood. Saw the report myself. He resigned before even seeing it. The poor kid with a dad so careless. She finished and left in a huff. Jenny stood there, replaying everything in her mind, feeling dizzy. What had she done to Richard? He had tried to explain, but she assumed he was lying. He wanted that report, but instead, she had Susan knock him out and lock him up. Then, she ignored his calls, causing him to miss his grandfather's last moments. Whenever he needed her, where was she? Wrapped up in Michael's schemes. Now, guilt washed over Jenny, but her mind desperately sought someone to blame. Michael. He manipulated her, blinding her from seeing what really mattered. Just then, the door clicked open, and Michael walked in. Seeing Jenny still there, he smiled. Jenny, you. Before he could finish, Jenny had him by the throat. The thermos fell and shattered. Michael's throat choked, frantically slapping Jenny's arm. On the brink of passing out, he was flung away with a force. Gasping, Michael looked at Jenny in terror. Her eyes were red with fury, voice shaking. How could you? All along, under my nose, pulling strings. You falsely accused Richard just to drive him away. Besides hiding that health history, what else did you do? Michael, confused about how his scheme fell apart, stammered, I didn't do anything, Jenny. I really forgot about Tommy's heart problem. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He lunged forward, clinging to Jenny, crying. But she kicked him away with disgust. Get lost. Michael hit the floor, knocking over a cart with a clatter. The noise woke Tommy. Seeing his dad hurt, he cried, Auntie Jenny, don't hit my dad. My head hurts. Looking at Tommy now, the fondness she once had was gone, replaced by annoyance. But seeing the bandage on his head triggered a memory. When bringing Tommy to the hospital, Michael asked and possibly recorded some cruel things. Were those manipulated and fed to Richard? The thought sent shivers through Jenny. She hoped he didn't know, but what if he did? Her heart raced faster, and her eyes darted towards the phone. Grabbing it, she ordered Michael, unlock it. Michael was in tears, his handsome features twisted with crying. Even now, he clung to hope, pleading, Jenny, there's nothing on my phone. I really didn't say anything to Richard. Jenny didn't have the patience for his excuses. She lit up the phone, forced it open with his face by gripping his chin, and quickly checked phone. No sign of Richard among his contacts. She almost relaxed, but something led her to open Michael's posts. As she scrolled, an unfamiliar post caught her eye. It was a photo from the day she was sitting by the hospital bed. As she listened to the audio, his sneering voice filled the air. He's just an orphan. Where else could he go? At most, he ran off for surgery elsewhere. I've seen this act before. This post was shared with selected friends, so Jenny had never seen it. Now, who that friend was needed no explanation. How hurt must Richard have been hearing that? Jenny was a mix of regret and anger. She hurled the phone at Michael's face, shouting, You bastard! The phone cut his forehead, stinging and blinding him with stars from the pain. Despite the hurt, he crawled to her, clinging to her pants, begging, Jenny, you can't treat me this way. I saved your life. Savior? Jenny scoffed bitterly and kicked him away. It was because of that ridiculous, life-saving obligation I let you into my life and hurt Richard. Michael trembled with pain, eyes widened as Jenny turned to leave. He shouted, Jenny, I really love you. Why do you have to choose Richard? I can love you too. Jenny paused, looking at him in disgust. You? Compete with my Richard? Don't say you love me. You just want my money. Show up in front of me again, and I swear I'll kill you. With that, Jenny stormed out of the room. Michael lay on the ground, watching her leave, filled with despair. One thought echoed in his mind. It's over. Back in the States, he was just a rat in the slums. Saving Jenny got him a good life. Turning back now? Unthinkable. But, despite the unwillingness, there was nothing he could do. Soon, the hospital informed Michael about Tommy's room dues, saying they needed to leave without further payment. Rushing to the billing department, he realized Jenny had frozen all his cards. "Jenny, you wouldn't be this cruel?" he muttered, panicking. He called her repeatedly, only to find her unreachable. He texted, only to discover she'd blocked him. With no cash, Michael had to take Tommy home. Arriving there, he found Susan with workers moving his stuff out of the villa. He rushed to stop them. "No, you can't take my things." Susan adjusted her glasses and coldly warned, "Michael, stop causing trouble. The house was only lent by Jenny, and she's reclaiming it. Your belongings are all intact, so just be sensible." Workers emptied the house quickly, pushing Michael and his son out of the estate. Relentlessly, Michael tried to get back in, but the guards weren't lenient, chasing him out with batons. "Leave or I'll have to use force," bellowed a burly guard. Fearful, Michael gathered his luggage and left with his son. Homeless and penniless, they wound up under a bridge. As night turned to dawn, Tommy suddenly spiked a fever. Touching his son's burning forehead, Michael panicked, "Tommy, don't scare Daddy." Rushing Tommy to the hospital again, the diagnosis hit hard. Tommy had myocarditis and escalating congenital heart disease. Hospitalization was urgent, and a heart transplant necessary, costing $50,000. Michael was stunned. Where could he get $50,000 when he was flat broke? He pleaded, "Doctor, start treating my son. I'll get the money fast." Seeing his desperation, the hospital agreed temporarily. Michael headed straight to Jenny's office, begging outside with disheveled hair. "Jenny, I really messed up. Please save Tommy. We are your saviors." His cries were relentless, but Jenny never appeared. Eventually, security tossed him out. Lying on the roadside without dignity, Michael wailed helplessly. Options gone, he sought work, yet lacking education and skills. Fast cash was found only in shady places. He took a nightclub job as a waiter, barely earning enough to buy Tommy's meds. Saving $50,000 seemed impossible. Over a toilet, vomiting violently and feeling the burn in his gut, Michael wept with regret. In that moment, he realized what it felt like to wish for death over life. Jenny, having left the hospital, quickly booked a flight to City C. She needed to find Richard and explain everything. She conceded her mistakes and would do anything to win him back. This time, Jenny prepared thoroughly, even having Susan locate Annie's home address. Upon reaching the military compound, neighbors told her, "Oh, Annie? She's out on a mission. Her husband's a great guy, a military doctor now, while we spouses stay here." Jenny hadn't expected to miss them, but wouldn't give up. "Do you know where their mission is?" she asked urgently. "Those are classified," shrugged the neighbor and walked off. Jenny stood there for ages, frozen with shock. During this time, Richard traveled with Annie, helping many along the way. Their final destination was J City, where tensions from terrorists had spiked patient numbers. Constantly in surgery at work, Richard was in military hospital life, seldom seeing Annie. When able, they'd reassure each other via texts. Busy as they were, Richard felt an even closer bond with Annie, something deeper than friendship, more beautiful than love. One day, exiting the operating room, a call flashed from H City. "Hello, Richard? This is from Watson Private Hospital. Mr. Gary's critically ill, and he wishes to see you." Richard dropped his new phone in shock, nearly shattering it. Heart racing, he hastily picked it up. "I'll come right away. Please do everything to save him." Saying the last words, his voice broke into tears. Gary was Jenny's grandpa's real name. How could Grandpa suddenly be so ill? Richard heard that familiar sound in his ears again. After wiping his blurry eyes, he rushed to the boss's office to ask for leave and booked a flight back to H City. Even though he was exhausted, Richard couldn't sleep on the way. His heart was racing with anxiety, worried he might miss seeing Jenny's grandfather one last time. Losing his own grandfather left him with regrets, and he feared facing the same outcome with Jenny's grandfather. This was, after all, one of the two elders who loved him the most in this world. Once he landed, Richard took a cab to the hospital. He dashed all the way to the VIP room and burst through the door without hesitation. "Grandpa!" he exclaimed. Racing to the bedside, Richard's eyes were red, but then he froze. Jenny's grandfather was sitting up, playing Candy Crush, looking vibrant and nothing like a sick man. Richard's back, Jenny's grandfather said, putting his phone down with a smile as he waved at Richard. Richard walked over and sat by the bed, examining Jenny's grandfather carefully before finally breathing a sigh of relief. So you're okay. Even though he knew he was played, Richard felt only relief. He would rather be fooled by Jenny's grandfather 100 times than experience the real loss of a loved one. That kind of pain is a lifelong thing that suffocates whenever remembered. With the heaviness that had lingered during his journey now lifted, Richard felt lighter. He looked at Jenny's grandfather in exasperation. "Grandpa, why did you scare me like that? Hearing you were critically ill almost gave me a heart attack." Jenny's grandfather, seeing the dark circles under Richard's eyes, felt guilty and patted his hand. "Must have been a rough trip back, huh? But I had no other choice. If I didn't call you this time, maybe I wouldn't get to see you anymore." Richard lowered his head at those words. He had changed his number and cut off past connections. But shutting out Jenny's grandfather might have hurt the old man's feelings after all. After all, he didn't know how to face him. Sniffling with his emotions on edge, Richard murmured, "I'm sorry, Grandpa." With a gentle sigh, a warm hand came to rest on Richard's head. "Silly boy, what are you apologizing for? I know it was that girl Jenny who broke your heart. You did nothing wrong. It was her loss. But know this, to me, even if you're not my grandson-in-law, you're still my grandson." Unable to hold back any longer, Richard hugged Jenny's grandfather and cried. Hadn't he always thought of Jenny's grandfather as his own? How could he bear cutting off this bond? Jenny's grandfather held Richard, gently patting his back to soothe him. Once he calmed down, he asked, "Is your wife treating you well?" Richard wasn't surprised he knew about Annie and nodded. "Yes, she's a wonderful person. She treats me well." Jenny's grandfather, perceptive as always, smiled. "Do you love her?" Richard blushed a little but nodded earnestly. "I do." Jenny's grandfather looked at him with warmth, caressing his face. "If she's who you love, she's the best for you. When you have your wedding, I want to be there." Richard's eyes welled up, and he nodded vigorously. "Okay." The atmosphere was cozy until urgent footsteps interrupted. "Richard." Jenny rushed into the room, her eyes welling at the sight of Richard. "You're back." She seemed worse for wear, her cheeks sunken, her lovely face thinner and altered. Richard frowned at seeing Jenny, not wanting to deal with her. He stood and informed Jenny's grandfather, "Grandpa, I need to head back. I didn't take much time off, and there are patients waiting for me." Jenny's grandfather nodded with a smile. "I'll have a driver take you. Call me before your wedding." Richard reluctantly hugged Jenny's grandfather and then rose to leave. His assistant followed, offering, "I'll arrange a driver for you." Richard nodded, not sparing Jenny a glance as he passed her. Jenny hurriedly tried to grab him. "Richard, I'm sorry. Please, don't leave." Jenny's grandfather's face turned stern. "Jason, hold her back." Jenny was restrained by the bodyguards, forced to watch as Richard walked away. Her eyes were red, and she struggled, yelling, "Richard, don't leave me, please." But Richard didn't stop, never looking back. When he finally disappeared from view, they released Jenny. She immediately tried to chase after him, but her grandfather's sharp voice stopped her. "Jenny, will you still not let go?" Frozen in place, Jenny's red eyes met her grandfather's in frustration. "Grandpa, why didn't you tell me Richard was back? He's my fiancé. How can I just let him marry someone else? I want him back." Her grandfather looked at her coldly. "He was your fiancé, but you gave up on him. He's married now." Jenny gritted her teeth. "I don't accept her as his wife. She's not even better than me. I'll get Richard back." Her grandfather sighed at her stubbornness. "You're relying on the Miller's family status, but let me tell you, Annie's family isn't any less. She's the granddaughter of a high-ranking leader, and her uncle is the chairman of Changhua Group. The power they have is immense." Jenny's face turned pale as realization hit. "From that company incident?" Her grandfather nodded. "Yes, Annie was behind it." Defeated, Jenny's eyes glistened with unwillingness but soon showed despair. If Annie's family's status surpassed her own, how could she retrieve Richard? That same day, Richard flew back to J City. He had one more day of leave, which he spent resting and catching up on sleep before returning to work. Life went on, with Richard busily tending to patients. During spare moments, he'd chat with Annie, sharing what he ate, saw, or the interesting cases he had. Her replies were infrequent but comforting nonetheless. Until one day, a day and a half passed without a single reply from Annie. It was unusual and it worried Richard. He tried to reassure himself, thinking she might be on a mission. But by the 48th hour, he could no longer sit still. Just as he was about to call her, a nurse rushed over. "Richard, your wife Annie was hit by a stray bullet. She needs surgery consent. Come." Richard ran with the nurse to the OR, his mind buzzing as he saw Annie, bloody and still, through the glass. Her lifelessness terrified him. A doctor used to death and blood, Richard was never afraid of it until now. He feared he might lose the Annie who always charmed him with her playful smiles. Tears instantly flowed, paralyzing him, unable to move. It was the nurse who helped him sign the consent form, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely hold the pen. The surgery light flickered on, and Richard took a seat in the hallway, waiting. As someone usually inside the OR, he never knew how excruciating it was to wait during a surgery. An hour later, the surgery was over. When the operating room doors opened, Richard rushed forward just like any other anxious family member. The surgery was performed by the most experienced head of the department, but Richard still couldn't relax. Thankfully, the doctor removed his mask and said something that brought Richard comfort. "Richard, your wife's surgery was a success. Now we just wait for her to wake up." Richard sighed with relief, thanked him, and then went to the recovery room to be by Annie's side. He gently wiped Annie's hands and face. Sitting by the bedside, he admired her pale yet handsome face. When she slept, her face had a dignified calmness that seemed unusual. Her eyes, when open, often had a mischievous charm that suited her more. Richard got lost in thought, tracing Annie's brows and eyes with his finger. Suddenly, a hand caught his playful finger. "That tickles, honey," a scratchy voice said, startling Richard. He looked down to see Annie smiling at him with half-closed eyes. A wave of emotion hit him, and tears immediately fell. "Why are you crying?" Annie asked with concern. "Richard, you're being unfair. You're the one teasing me and keeping me from sleeping, yet you're the one crying." Annie's teasing words made Richard smile. He leaned down, hugged her gently, and whispered, "I'm just so glad you're okay." Hearing this, Annie's heart softened, and she comforted him, stroking his hair. "It's all right. I'm tough as nails. I'm not going anywhere. Now stop crying. I'd hate for you to have a breakdown before anything else does." Richard rolled his eyes at her dramatic words, playfully pushing her shoulder. "Don't say such unlucky things." Annie winced, making a little noise. Richard immediately got worried and stood up. "What happened? Did I hurt you? Was it your wound?" But Annie quickly grinned. "Gotcha." Richard almost got scared out of his wits, gave her a stern look, and pretended to leave. Annie swiftly grabbed his hand, playfully pleading, I'm sorry. Okay? No more teasing." She shook his hand, making it hard for him to stay mad. He pretended to be stern, but eventually sat back down by her bed. Looking at Annie, he spoke sincerely. "Annie, in the future, whether on missions or anything else, please be safe. As your husband, I worry about you. I know you care deeply for H Nation and would sacrifice yourself for it. But sometimes I wish you'd fear a little more and be a little less reckless because you have me and our home." His words, though softly spoken, entwined around Annie's heart like threads. She looked up at him suddenly and shouted, "Permission to speak?" Startled, Richard asked, "What's up?" Annie leaned in with a cheeky grin. "Permission to kiss granted." Richard blushed furiously, pulled back, denied, MMPH. The following week was very relaxed for Annie. Her husband was also her attending physician, allowing her to spend lots of time with him and admire his work. It was delightful. She often thought, I should have gotten hurt sooner so I could experience this comfort. One day, after the routine checkup, Richard opened the door to her room to find Annie looking at him eagerly, much like a loyal dog awaiting its owner's affection. He walked over and asked, slightly amused, "What's up?" Annie raised her eyebrows and tapped her lips. "You missed today's good morning kiss." Richard couldn't resist her sweet charms and, though trying to keep a straight face, said, "I'm on the clock right now. Lift your shirt so I can change the dressing." Annie grumbled about how heartless he was but obediently complied. Richard skillfully changed the bandage. When he looked up, he noticed Annie still gazing at him longingly. He chuckled and leaned down to plant a kiss at the corner of her lips. As he pulled away, her hand wrapped around his waist, their kiss deepening. Afterward, Richard leaned against Annie's shoulder, catching his breath. As they basked in the lingering warmth, a harsh voice shattered the moment. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard turned and saw Jenny storming in. Instinctively, he positioned himself protectively in front of Annie, frowning at Jenny. "Why are you here?" Jenny seemed hurt by Richard's stance and asked tearfully, "Richard, is she really that important to you?" "Well, yeah," Richard said coldly. "She's my wife, my family, and the love of my life. No one is going to hurt her while I'm around." Every word hit Jenny like bullets. Her pain was evident, and she trembled slightly. "Richard, what about me? We've been together for 20 years. Richard's gaze didn't waver. "You were important to me once, but that was in the past. Now you're just the granddaughter of an acquaintance." Desperation filled Jenny as she begged, "Richard, I've sent Michael back to America. Give me another chance, please. Just one more chance." Richard was just about to answer when Annie interjected, wrapping her arms around his waist and leaning her head on his shoulder. "Nope," she said sweetly. "Jenny, I don't agree to have you in our family. You're not even qualified to be a homewrecker." Seeing Annie's triumphant expression, Jenny was livid and lunged at her. But the guards burst in, pinning Jenny down and escorting her out. Jenny's eyes were wide with realization. "She let me in on purpose," she screamed, still struggling. Richard watched impassively as she was taken away. "Even if she did plot this, I still love her. And if you were as admirable as you think, I'd still dislike you." Jenny, overwhelmed, stopped struggling and was quickly let out. The room fell silent again. Richard crossed his arms and looked at Annie. "Did you do this on purpose?" Annie whistled, looking everywhere but at him until she finally shrugged. "All right, yeah, it was on purpose. She's just so annoying. But, was what you said earlier true?" Richard, knowing exactly what she meant, pretended to be clueless. "What was true?" Annie moved closer, eyes narrowing playfully. "That you love me even if I'm devious." Richard chuckled, "Not really." Scoffing, Annie replied, "I don't believe you. Tell me something true then." Staring into her eyes, Richard softly said, "When you get discharged, let's go meet my folks." After Annie was released, Richard took her to H-City. The Booth family resting place was in Green Mountain Cemetery. They could take the cable car or climb the stone steps up to it. It was a nice day, and Richard was in good spirits. "Let's just hike up," he suggested. Annie lifted her eyebrows. "You're the boss." Together, they held hands and climbed the steps. They chatted about childhood memories and breathed in the fresh air. Richard felt truly relaxed for the first time in ages. Seeing Richard so overjoyed, Annie watched over him, making sure he didn't trip in his enthusiasm. After 40 minutes, they reached the summit. The cemetery gates laid ahead. Richard paused, then led Annie towards his parents' grave. Though he hadn't visited in years, Richard knew he would find it. There seemed to be an unseen force guiding him, and soon, they found the gravestone. It had rained a few days prior, leaving photos on the gravestone misty and blurred. Richard was about to brush the dirt off with his hand when someone beside him knelt down and patiently cleaned the photo with their hand. Richard felt his heart soften as he crouched in front of his parents' tombstone. His eyes red but smiling as he said, "Mom, Dad, I brought your daughter-in-law. I remember, Mom, you said once that you loved heroic female soldiers. Well, she's a soldier. This daughter-in-law couldn't be more perfect, right? Annie squatted beside Richard, her heart aching when she saw his smiling lips but tearful eyes. Today, Annie wore a tailored suit, yet she didn't mind getting dirty. She knelt firmly in front of the tombstone. She bowed 3 times to Mr. and Mrs. Booth, saying sincerely, "Mom, Dad, thank you for raising such a wonderful son. Marrying Richard is the greatest blessing of my life. Promises are cheap, so I won't make any. I'll show through actions, giving everything I have to make Richard happy. Please trust me to take care of your son." After paying their respects, Richard and Annie slowly walked down the hill. Richard gently said, "Thank you, Annie." Annie laughed lightly, teasing, "That's a long staircase. All right? And just one thank you? You sure know how to make a deal. Back in the day, you'd be a real miser." Richard, being carried by her, lightly sighed. "What kind of thanks do you want?" With a smile, Annie answered, "A report." Richard smirked. "Tell me." "Request to marry." Approved. On March 22nd, Richard's birthday was also his wedding day. Annie's mission was over, and with Jenny's grandpa acting as family for Richard, the wedding wasn't as simple as planned. It turned out to be extravagant. Colton Hotel, the largest in Sea City, was booked entirely for the wedding, filled with flowers shipped directly, making it a sea of roses. In the dressing room, Richard was already in his tailored suit, with Jenny's grandpa complimenting him non-stop. "Richard, you really look handsome." "Annie is lucky. Why didn't you become part of the Miller's family?" Richard's own grandpa was there too, not pleased by what Jenny's grandpa said. "Hey man, that's not cool. We're family, and you're trying to poach my granddaughter?" Jenny's grandpa chuckled, and before long, the two were playfully arguing. Richard looked at himself in the mirror, feeling nothing but excitement for his future home. Finally, the host started the ceremony. Since Richard didn't have a father, he skipped the traditional hand-in-hand part and stood on the stage. But at the entrance, there was no sign of Annie. A moment later, a page came in quietly to tell the host, "Stall a bit, the bride isn't here yet." Sitting in the groom's family section, Jenny's grandpa was not pleased. "On such an important day? She's not on time. That's your family upbringing?" Annie's grandpa, relying on his cane, stayed silent, thinking how embarrassed he was by Annie, who was making her grandpa lose face. Guests noticed something was off, whispering to each other, adding to the chaos. Throughout it all, Richard remained calm and composed. Suddenly, the doors opened, and instead of Annie, it was Jenny. Dressed in bridal wedding attire, she looked like a bride herself. "Richard, if Annie's late for her wedding, it means she doesn't care. Come with me. Don't marry her." Jenny reached out to Richard. The guests were shocked, whispering even louder. Annie's grandpa was furious, shouting, "Stealing at my granddaughter's wedding? Get her out." 2 tall girls quickly grabbed Jenny and started to drag her out. Jenny panicked, struggling and saying, "Richard, I love you. I'll make it right. Please believe me." Richard finally gave her a glance and said, "Jenny, my wife once told me promises are cheap. So don't just talk, act. Give it your all for someone that's love. And you haven't done anything. Why would you say you love me?" Jenny, gritting her teeth, shot back, "What about Annie? What has she done to prove she loves you?" Richard wasn't interested in responding, but then a voice rang out. "Oh, here's my proof of love." Richard looked up to see Annie in a beautiful bridal gown. Her appearance was meticulously done, her hair up and her features boldly visible with charming eyes. Carrying a document, Annie marched up to Richard, softly saying, "Were you anxious, my handsome groom?" Richard chuckled. "I'm not, but the guests are eager to eat. They didn't come for our love story. All right, let's get moving then." With a soft smile, Annie handed over the document. "I know you grew up with someone but got nothing in return, wasting your youth. When the snow fell, you ended that chapter. Today, you trusted me with your life again. It's a gamble I don't want you to lose. I don't like making promises, so consider this my all-in bet." Richard looked at the document, eyes widening slowly. Annie explained patiently, "I've investigated your parents' accident. Your uncle and aunt are directly involved. This evidence is with the authorities, and they should be in custody now. Richard covered his mouth, shocked, tears falling from his eyes. In the next moment, he hugged her tightly. Annie seemed to chuckle, her chest shaking gently as she whispered near his ear, "You once asked what it means to give everything for you. This is my answer. Are you satisfied, my husband?" Richard couldn't find the words, so he just nodded vigorously. And silently, in his heart, he shouted, "I love you."